My name is Garrett Sullivan, and 4 months ago I watched my supervisor delete what he thought was just another spreadsheet and some meeting notes. He stood behind my workstation, announced to our entire department that my 2 years of work was outdated garbage, then hit delete while 28 people watched in silence. What he actually erased was the invisible system keeping our biggest industrial clients happy and our company profitable. And when my phone rang 35 minutes later with a $420,000 job offer, I realized he had just handed me the perfect opportunity for the most satisfying professional comeback of my 22-year career. Before I tell you exactly how watching him panic became one of the best moments of my working life, let me take you back to where this really started. Because revenge stories like this don't happen overnight. They build up over months of being underestimated by people who should know better. I'm 48 years old, been in manufacturing operations for over 2 decades. Started on the factory floor at 26, worked my way up through every department you can imagine. Got my engineering degree at night school while raising 3 kids, the kind of background that used to mean something in this business. Used to. 18 months ago, I joined Pinnacle Manufacturing Solutions as a senior operations analyst. The job seemed straightforward enough. Optimize supply chain processes for our industrial clients, mostly steel companies and automotive suppliers. Big, serious businesses that move millions of dollars worth of materials every month. The previous guy in my position had lasted 6 months before quitting, which should have been a warning sign. My new supervisor, Hayden Cross, made it clear from day one that he considered my approach outdated. Hayden was 32, fresh from Northwestern with an MBA and exactly 4 years of total work experience. All of it in consulting firms, none of it actually inside a manufacturing plant. But he was the director of operations and I was just the analyst. Hayden believed everything could be solved with the latest software and data analytics. Industry 4.0, he called it. Digital transformation, smart manufacturing. He had all the buzzwords down cold. What he didn't have was any understanding of how things actually worked when you had 500,000 tons of steel that needed to move from Pittsburgh to Detroit on a tight schedule. But I saw something different in those first few weeks reviewing our client files. Page after page of generic process reports that read like they were written by robots. No understanding of the real challenges these companies faced. No sense that anyone at Pinnacle had ever bothered to learn how their operations actually function day to day. So I started doing something that seemed radical in Hayden's data-driven world. I began treating our clients like real businesses run by real people who knew their operations better than any consultant ever would. When I called Roger Bachman at Steelworks International for a routine quarterly review, instead of running through a checklist, I asked him about the rail transportation bottleneck that had been mentioned in their last quarterly report. Turned out they were still dealing with it 6 months later. We spent an hour on the phone working through solutions that fit their actual constraints, not some theoretical optimization model. 2 weeks later, Roger called me directly instead of going through our main number. The rail solution I'd suggested had saved them $80,000 that month alone. He wanted to know if we could look at their warehouse operations next. When Louise Hartman at Precision Automotive mentioned they were struggling with supplier quality control, I didn't just recommend our standard audit package. I dug into their specific supplier network, learned about the family-owned shops they preferred working with, and developed a quality improvement plan that worked with their existing relationships instead of forcing them to switch to our approved vendor list. Louise ended up expanding her contract with us by $150,000 to cover additional facilities. These weren't revolutionary changes. I was just listening to what our clients actually needed and developing solutions that fit their real-world operations instead of forcing them into cookie-cutter processes that looked good in PowerPoint presentations. But Hayden never understood what I was doing. He would walk past my desk and see me on hour-long phone calls with clients, reviewing plant layouts and transportation schedules, and I could feel his disapproval from across the office. During our monthly reviews, he'd flip through my activity reports with obvious frustration. "Why are you spending 90 minutes on calls that should take 30?" he'd ask, tapping his stylus against his tablet. "Our efficiency metrics show you're processing fewer client interactions per hour than optimal." I tried explaining that longer conversations were building stronger relationships, that clients were specifically requesting to work with me on new projects, that our contract renewal rate had improved by 41% since I started taking a more hands-on approach. But Hayden only cared about numbers that fit his dashboard analytics. What he didn't realize was that I was building something far more valuable than efficient call logs. I was becoming the bridge between Pinnacle and the people who actually kept our lights on. Month after month, I watched our client satisfaction scores climb, while Hayden remained focused on efficiency metrics that completely missed the point. He was measuring how quickly we could process interactions, while I was building the relationships that would determine whether those interactions continued happening at all. The breaking point came during our annual strategic planning session. Our CEO, Preston Wade, was reviewing department performance when he mentioned that industrial client retention had reached an all-time high. He specifically praised our hands-on approach and suggested expanding the personalized service model across other client sectors. I watched Hayden's expression shift as the credit for improved retention landed squarely on what he considered my inefficient methods. After the meeting ended, he cornered me near the conference room. "I don't know what kind of old-school networking you're running," he said, his voice tight with controlled irritation, "but this company succeeds on systematic excellence, not relationship management from the 1990s. That's when he dropped the assignment that would change everything. He wanted me to complete a comprehensive documentation project of all my client optimization work over the past 18 months. Every process improvement, every efficiency gain, every cost-saving measure I had implemented needed to be systematically recorded and analyzed. It was clearly intended as punishment, hundreds of hours of bureaucratic busywork that would pull me away from the actual client work that was driving our success. But I approached the documentation project with the same attention to detail that I brought to client operations. If Hayden wanted systematic proof of what relationship-based consulting could accomplish, I'd give him exactly that. I spent 6 weeks creating detailed records showing not just what improvements had been implemented, but how those improvements had translated into measurable business outcomes for our clients. I documented every phone call, every site visit, every customized solution that had emerged from actually understanding how our clients' operations functioned. The transportation optimization I'd developed with Roger Bachman had saved Steelworks International $480,000 annually. The supplier quality improvements I'd implemented with Louise Hartman had reduced Precision Automotive's defect rates by 62% and saved them $220,000 per year. The inventory management system I'd designed for Midwest Fabrication had cut their carrying costs by another $220,000 annually. Page after page of documented proof that hands-on, relationship-based consulting was directly responsible for over $1.4 million in verified client cost savings. Every conversation about plant operations and supply chain challenges had strengthened business partnerships that our competitors couldn't replicate with their generic systematic approaches. The finished documentation was 67 pages of evidence that treating clients as unique businesses with specific challenges was not only more effective than systematic processes, but significantly more profitable. Each relationship I'd built had generated measurable results that could be tracked directly to bottom-line improvements. I was proud of that documentation. It represented not just 18 months of work, but 18 months of real improvements that had made our clients more profitable and efficient, which made what happened next feel like a personal attack on everything I'd accomplished. Hayden called an all-hands department meeting on a Tuesday morning in early October. He announced that we needed to review our client service protocols and that my documentation would serve as a case study for discussion. I assumed he was finally ready to acknowledge that relationship-based consulting was driving our improved performance. Instead, he directed me to display my documentation files on the main conference room screen while the entire department watched. Then he began dissecting every process improvement, every client relationship, every hands-on approach as evidence of inefficient resource allocation. "This is exactly the kind of unscalable methodology that prevents systematic growth," he declared, scrolling through months of detailed documentation. Spending 90 minutes optimizing one client's transportation logistics instead of developing repeatable processes that work for all clients. These files represent a complete failure to embrace modern consulting efficiency. I felt heat spreading across my neck as 28 coworkers watched him tear apart work that had generated over $1 million in verified client savings. He was presenting my greatest professional accomplishment as a cautionary tale about what not to do in modern business. Each page of documentation that had taken hours to compile was being dismissed as evidence of outdated thinking. The client relationships that had driven our department's success were being characterized as inefficient time wasting. The cost savings that had impressed our CEO were being reframed as lucky accidents that couldn't be systematically replicated. But then he did something that crossed every line of professional respect I thought existed in corporate America. He pulled up the master file containing my complete documentation database, every client improvement, every relationship detail, every process optimization that proved how hands-on consulting was driving our business success. His cursor moved toward the delete option while he continued lecturing about the need for systematic efficiency. "This entire approach is garbage," he announced, his finger hovering over the deletion command. "Beginning today, we return to scalable, systematic client service protocols." And then he clicked delete. I watched 18 months of relationship building disappear from the screen. 67 pages of documented improvements that had generated over $1.4 million in client value, gone in one vindictive moment designed to humiliate me in front of every person I worked with. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Everyone was processing what had just happened. 28 people had just watched their colleagues' work get destroyed, not because it was ineffective, but because it didn't fit the supervisor's preferred methodology. Hayden turned away from the screen with a satisfied expression, clearly expecting me to accept this humiliation and start rebuilding my work according to his preferred systematic methods. He probably thought he had just delivered a decisive blow that would force me to abandon relationship-based consulting and embrace his efficiency-focused approach. But he had made one crucial miscalculation that would destroy everything he thought he was protecting. While he was destroying my documentation, he hadn't destroyed the actual relationships I had built with our industrial clients. The trust Roger Bachman had in my understanding of steel transportation logistics, the confidence Louise Hartman had in my supplier quality solutions, the respect I had earned from plant managers and operations directors across the Midwest. Those relationships existed in their experience with real results, not in computer files. And apparently, some of those relationships had been paying more attention to Pinnacle's internal dynamics than anyone realized. My phone started vibrating before Hayden had finished explaining his new systematic protocols. The caller ID showed Apex Industrial Partners, a consulting firm that specialized in manufacturing operations. I stepped out of the conference room to take the call, my hands still shaking from watching my work get deleted in front of everyone. "Garrett," said the voice on the other end, "we've been tracking the industrial client improvements at Pinnacle, and we know exactly who's responsible for that success. We want to talk." The conversation that followed changed everything. Apex Industrial had been monitoring our client retention improvements through industry connections, and they knew exactly which consultant was building the relationships that kept major accounts satisfied. They had been planning to approach me for months, but watching Hayden destroy my documentation had convinced them that timing was perfect. "We're prepared to offer you $420,000 annually to join our team as VP of Operations," they said. "Plus equity participation and complete autonomy over client relationship strategies. We believe hands-on consulting is the future of industrial services, and we want you to build that future with us. $420,000. Nearly double my current compensation, working for people who valued exactly what Hayden considered inefficient garbage. But the most beautiful part of their offer wasn't the money. "We know you can't bring proprietary information from Pinnacle," they continued. "But we also know that industrial relationships are built on trust and proven results, not on database files. If you choose to join us, and if clients choose to work with someone they trust rather than staying with someone who treats them like systematic processes, that's simply the natural consequence of different business philosophies." I understood immediately what they were suggesting. They weren't asking me to steal clients or violate any legal agreements. They were simply pointing out that if I left Pinnacle and clients decided they preferred working with someone who understood their actual operations instead of theoretical optimization models, that was their choice to make. When I walked back into the conference room, Hayden was still lecturing about systematic efficiency standards while my former colleagues stared at their notebooks, clearly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. He noticed my return and paused his presentation. "Do you have questions about our new service protocols?" he asked. I looked around the room at people I had worked alongside for 18 months, then at the blank screen where my documentation had been displayed before being destroyed, then back at Hayden's expectant expression. "Actually," I said, "I have something to announce. I'm resigning from Pinnacle Manufacturing Solutions effective immediately. I'll be joining Apex Industrial Partners as their VP of Operations. The conference room went completely silent. You could hear the HVAC system humming and someone's pen clicking nervously. Hayden's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion, then to something that looked like panic. You can't just quit in the middle of a department meeting. There are protocols, notice requirements, transition procedures. Actually, I replied, pulling out my phone to show the contract offer I had just received. My employment agreement allows for immediate resignation in cases of hostile work environment or professional misconduct. Having my work deleted in front of colleagues while being publicly humiliated qualifies on both counts. Preston Wade, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. Perhaps we should discuss this privately before making any hasty decisions. But I was done with private discussions and diplomatic solutions. Hayden had chosen to humiliate me publicly, so he would get to experience the consequences just as publicly. There's nothing to discuss. My decision is final. I'll submit formal resignation paperwork within the hour. As I walked toward the conference room exit, I could feel 28 pairs of eyes following my movement. Some of my coworkers looked shocked, others looked impressed, and a few looked like they were reconsidering their own career choices. Hayden called after me, his voice higher than usual. You're making a huge mistake. Apex Industrial is a mid-tier firm with no proven track record in systematic consulting. You're throwing away job security for some fantasy about relationship management being more important than scalable processes. I paused at the doorway and turned back to face him. We'll see which approach proves more valuable. Within 48 hours, I had cleaned out my office, completed exit interviews, and started my new position at Apex Industrial. Their headquarters was smaller than Pinnacle's, but filled with energy and excitement about building something innovative in the manufacturing consulting space. More importantly, I was finally working with people who understood that industrial operations were built on practical solutions and trusted relationships, not efficiency metrics and systematic protocols. But the real validation of my decision came in the weeks that followed, as I watched the natural consequences of Hayden's actions unfold with devastating precision. I hadn't reached out to any Pinnacle clients. I hadn't made recruitment calls or sent transition emails. I simply updated my professional profiles to reflect my new position and continued being the same consultant who had spent 18 months building authentic relationships with people who needed real-world manufacturing solutions. The first call came on Thursday morning, 3 days after I started at Apex Industrial. Roger Bachman at Steelworks International called my new direct line. Garrett, he said, I heard through the industry network that you've moved to a new firm. I wanted to congratulate you and ask about Apex's capabilities in steel transportation optimization. We talked for 90 minutes about his upcoming expansion plans, his continuing challenges with rail logistics, and yes, how that transportation solution we developed was still saving them $80,000 monthly. By the end of the conversation, he had scheduled a formal presentation meeting to discuss transitioning Steelworks' consulting contract to Apex Industrial. The second call came that same afternoon. Louise Hartman at Precision Automotive wanted to discuss her upcoming facility expansion with someone who understood her supplier network and quality control challenges. I've been working with consulting firms for 15 years, she told me, and you're the first person who ever made me feel like my operations mattered beyond the invoice amount. If you're offering the same hands-on approach at your new firm, I'm very interested in making a change. By the end of my first week at Apex Industrial, I had received calls from 6 former Pinnacle clients. Not because I had solicited them, but because they preferred working with someone who treated their operations as unique challenges requiring customized solutions rather than systematic processes. Meanwhile, back at Pinnacle Manufacturing, Hayden was starting to realize what he had actually deleted when he destroyed my relationship-building documentation. I heard about his growing panic through mutual connections in the professional community. Apparently, he had tried to reach out to major clients for routine check-ins, only to discover that many of them were no longer interested in continuing their contracts under his new systematic approach. When he called Roger Bachman to schedule Steelworks' quarterly review, Roger politely informed him that they were exploring other consulting options and would not be renewing their annual agreement. When he contacted Louise Hartman about Precision Automotive's expansion project, Louise explained that she had found a consulting partner who better understood her operational requirements. One by one, the clients I had spent 18 months building relationships with were making the choice to work with someone who remembered their specific challenges, their operational constraints, and their individual business philosophies. Hayden had believed that client loyalty was tied to Pinnacle's brand reputation and systematic service quality. He was discovering that client loyalty was actually tied to the personal trust that made operations managers feel understood and supported. The third week after my departure, I received a call that made everything clear about how devastating Hayden's decision had become. Preston Wade contacted me personally to discuss what he called a potential partnership opportunity between our firms. It was obvious from our conversation that Pinnacle was experiencing the worst client retention crisis in company history. Major industrial accounts representing over 70% of their annual revenue were either terminating contracts or declining to renew. Wade wanted to know if Apex Industrial would be interested in acquiring some of Pinnacle's remaining client relationships during what he described as a strategic restructuring process. The company that had considered my relationship-based approach outdated garbage was now hoping to sell their remaining assets to the firm that had been built on exactly the principles Hayden had rejected. During our conversation, Wade mentioned that they were also reevaluating leadership approaches in their operations department. Reading between the lines, it was clear that Hayden's position was no longer secure. "I have to ask," he said toward the end of our call, "what would it take to bring you back to Pinnacle as Director of Operations? We're prepared to offer significant compensation increases and complete autonomy over client relationship strategies." The irony was incredible. 3 weeks after watching my work get deleted in front of my colleagues, I was being recruited back to implement exactly the same approach at a higher salary, with complete authority over the department that had rejected my methods. But I had no interest in returning to work for people who had only learned to value relationship-based consulting after losing millions of dollars in revenue. "I appreciate the offer," I told him, "but I'm very happy with my current position." Apex Industrial understood the value of hands-on client relationships from day one, rather than having to learn it through crisis. 6 months after leaving Pinnacle Manufacturing, I was promoted to senior partner at Apex Industrial with equity participation and responsibility for expanding our relationship-based consulting philosophy across multiple manufacturing sectors. The clients who had followed me from Pinnacle became the foundation for our most successful year in company history. Meanwhile, Pinnacle Manufacturing underwent the strategic restructuring that Wade had euphemistically described. They laid off 40% of their staff, sold their main office building, and ultimately merged with a larger firm that valued systematic processes over client relationships. Hayden was not retained during the merger. I learned about his departure through LinkedIn updates and industry network conversations. According to former colleagues, he had spent his final months at Pinnacle trying to rebuild client relationships using the same systematic approach that had caused the crisis in the first place. He apparently never understood that the problem wasn't his technical knowledge or consulting skills. The problem was his fundamental belief that industrial operations could be optimized through generic processes instead of customized solutions. The last update I heard about his situation came from a mutual professional contact who mentioned that he was having difficulty finding comparable positions because his most recent role had ended during a major client retention crisis. Potential employers were understandably concerned about hiring someone whose management approach had contributed to such significant revenue loss. Today, nearly a year after watching my documentation files get deleted in front of 28 colleagues, I'm running the manufacturing consulting division for one of the fastest-growing industrial services firms in the Midwest. Our success is built entirely on the principle that Hayden rejected, that industrial relationships thrive when clients feel understood, supported, and confident that their unique operational challenges are being addressed by people who actually know how manufacturing works. Every day I get to work with plant managers and operations directors who appreciate having their real-world constraints understood, their successful practices respected, and their business challenges addressed with genuine expertise in their specific industries. And every day I'm reminded that the best response to people who undervalue your contributions is simply proving them wrong through continued success elsewhere. Hayden thought he was deleting inefficient documentation when he destroyed my relationship-building work. What he actually deleted was the only thing preventing his professional world from collapsing around him. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is just letting people experience the natural consequences of their own terrible decisions while you build something better somewhere else. The clients who trusted me didn't follow me because I recruited them. They followed me because they valued working with someone who understood that behind every manufacturing operation are real people trying to solve real problems. And when those people had to choose between systematic efficiency and proven results, they chose the consultant who had always treated them like the experts in their own businesses. That's a lesson Hayden learned too late to save his career, but just in time to validate everything I'd believed about the value of genuine professional relationships.